Welcome to Fostering Parenthood. Consent, porn,
normal relationship,
being a teen mom,
my first real adult love,
what it's like to be a foster child.
Every person I had an attachment with had left.
How trauma impacts your decision making.
I didn't feel very accepted and I didn't feel very safe.
And he said, you are lowering your own value by putting up with this.
But I wish someone was there to be there and tell me that it wasn't okay.
How do I honor providing that space for them?
It's about being in a place to be open to someone sharing with you their hurts.
Making sure that you guys are going into things open and supportive, or just even willing, right, to have these conversations.
I need you to find the strength to call someone and say, I'm drowning right now.
It's helpful to know yourself first as a caregiver.
But I just want caregivers to know that you're not alone.
You called me mom. This episode discusses sensitive subjects including abuse and child sexual exploitation. Please exercise discretion while listening. Welcome to Fostering Parenthood, where we explore the challenges and triumphs of parenting youth in care. In today's episode, we're going to delve into the difficult topic of commercial sexual exploitation of children, otherwise known as CSEC, in foster care. We'll learn how caregivers can support their foster youth who have experienced abuse or CSEC and gain valuable insights from two inspiring guests. First, we're going to hear from Nola Brantley. She is a survivor of sexual abuse and sex trafficking and a passionate advocate for survivors of CSEC. Nola is the founder of Nola Brantley Speaks and served as MISSSEY's executive director from the organization's inception until 2014. Drawing from her own personal and professional experiences, Nola will provide invaluable tips and guidance for you, our caregivers. Then we'll speak with Brandy, a Reproductive Health Equity Project Youth Advisory Board member and survivor of CSEC herself as a foster youth. Brandy courageously volunteered to share her story and her journey towards healing with us. If you'd like to have a conversation about CSEC with your youth in care, please read the Trauma-Informed Conversation Guide, which can be found in the show notes. I'd like everybody to really listen for the next 20 minutes or so to this topic that many of us don't want to hear about. It's an uncomfortable thing to hear about. It's not a good view of what our society oftentimes looks the other way at. Nola Brantley is nationally acclaimed for her work in bringing this important issue to the forefront, making changes and making sure that there is an awareness of the reality of what our kiddos are going through. Nola, thank you for being here this morning. If you could share with us your background and what makes you so passionate about this topic.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for having me as well. I'm glad to be here to talk about the topic of commercially sexually exploited children and youth. It is such an important topic for foster care providers to be aware of. And so I'm glad that we're shedding some light on that. But I have had a really, really wonderful career working around this topic after a not so easy childhood experience. Like many of the youth that end up experiencing commercial sexual exploitation, they usually have a lot of other challenging experiences before that happens. And I was no different than, many others. And so I definitely walked that road. And they not only have had challenging experiences in their childhood, but they usually come from families where there are patterns of generational trauma. And not only do their families have patterns of generational trauma, but they usually come from communities and ethnic groups that have been historically oppressed in this country, and even in current day society, really, struggle with the impacts of things like structural racism and discrimination. So the individuals that experience this, definitely, that's what I share most in common with them. You know, our stories of exactly how we were exploited, I think those stories are more unique. But the story of kind of the upbringing and the kind of risk factors and the compounding, you know, societal factors that really led to not only our exploitation, but also kind of society's complacency about many of us being exploited, especially when we're women of color and girls of color. You know, all of those things are those factors that come all together, you know, and for my, you know, own story, you know, I have the kind of added factors of my father going into the war at a very young age before his 18th birthday, and my mother being raised in the foster care system in the state of New York. And so that gave them very little internal and external resources coming from poverty on both sides to be able to, you know, raise their children. And so that was part of that legacy that we inherited that became part of that risk. You know, for some of the experiences that we've all had, you know, in our lives growing up. And so, yeah, but I got to thankfully, you know, get to the other side of that, which lots of people don't, and got to use my experiences to really make a positive impact on my community and my state and my nation. And so I'm really, you know, grateful for that.
Well, this is such a difficult topic. I noticed when I was reading your bio that one of the terms you used is domestic minor sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation of children. Would you define those and the differences?
Sure. I'll start off defining the word, excuse me, sexually exploited child. Because a sexually exploited child is a child who is in need of having their basic needs met. That could be food, clothing, shelter, love, attention, affirmation, because we're talking about children. And you have an adult that offers to meet those basic needs, but wants to have sex with them and does. So that's the sexual exploitation. Now, the next layer of that, which would be the commercial sexual exploitation, what they call child sex trafficking, what they call domestic minor sex trafficking, all the same thing. That would be when there's a third person involved. So now you have this child who may or may not be having their basic needs met. You know, that may or may not be part of the dynamic. The bigger part of the dynamic is you have this third person that is manipulating the child into engaging in prostitution so that they can make a profit off of the child. And sometimes they manipulate them through psychological coercion, you know, through emotional manipulation. Sometimes it's through threat and, you know, physical force. It's all type of different tactics they use, but, you know, all of them are, you know, in ways to coerce and, you know, force and threaten and manipulate the kids into being in the sex industry for the purpose of somebody making a profit. You know, whether that be, you know, someone that used to be an ex-drug dealer from the street, whether that be somebody's parents or, you know, foster care parents, whether that be a police officer, like my trafficker was a San Francisco police officer who ended up trafficking me for 3 years of my teenage years. You know, it could be lots of different people. Anyone that receives, you know, money or something of monetary value in exchange for somebody having sex with the child, that would make them a trafficker. It doesn't look one way. It's anyone that's involved in that. And we have seen that to be all different kind of people, you know, sadly and unfortunately. So that's the element, though, when you have those three people involved: the child that's being sold, the person that's paying to have sex with the child, and then the person profiting off of the child's sexual abuse and exploitation. That's when you have a commercially sexually exploited child.
Oh, I really appreciate that definition, because I struggle sometimes as a caregiver. We have a lot of kiddos that come through our home. Many of them have, you know, very complex needs. We know that they've been through trauma, but it's really hard to really determine, you know, are they a victim of CSEC? Is it child abuse, meaning sexual abuse? When I hear you say something about the fact that a child is just getting their basic needs met, but having to have sex with the caregiver or their primary caregiver, parent, whatever, to get those needs met, it falls under that same umbrella, correct?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, it's definitely a form of sexual abuse. Sexual exploitation and commercial sexual exploitation. Notice they both have the word sexual in them, just like sexual abuse.
Sure.
It's like sexual abuse at its worst. And the majority of the kids, anywhere between 80 to 95%, varying in the statistics, but you see it's very high. They were sexually abused in earlier childhood before they were sex trafficked. So it is, for many of the children, it happens on a continuum. Starts with early childhood sexual abuse. Next, they experience sexual exploitation. And then lastly, they end up in the commercial sex industry. So unfortunately, for too many children, it happens on a continuum of abuse that can start really early on in childhood and then end up, in their teenage years or earlier on in the commercial sex industry. My father was my first sexual abuser. So for me, it started before I could walk or talk. And then it ended up in the commercial sex industry, but traveling that continuum, like so many other kids travel that end up in the commercial sex industry.
And I guess that's why we, as caregivers, often see it in foster care, right? Because so many of our kids have been abused and have suffered from sexual abuse. And now you've got a caregiver who doesn't understand their history of what they went through, and we wonder why they are open to predators oftentimes. We can talk about the fear of predators and the fear of putting themselves in harm's way, but it's almost something that's almost set up in their brain that this is what I have to do to survive. This is what I have to do to move ahead. They were taught at such an early age that their body is powerful. How do we break that? How do we help these kids with these behaviors that can be sexually in nature, and how do we help them to, or warn them against becoming a victim of CSEC?
Well, I think it's a few things. I mean, I think we can't put all of the responsibility on the kids, that they're children, and that there's things that we have to do that then create them being more safer. So example, make sure their basic needs are met, both tangible and intangible, right? So make sure they have the food, clothing, and shelter that they need in adequate time. And make sure you're paying attention to things that are important, like girls of color. They have different hair. Don't make them have to go to a sex trafficker just to get their hair braided.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
100%.
It's not a and look, it's not a fashion thing. It's actually a hair maintenance thing. Like even me, you see my hair is braided. I had to pay to get this done. Yeah, and I'm a mixed girl, but and so if I really just wanted to wear my hair curly in our culture, I'd be still seen as pretty and it would be beautiful. There's girls who have hair that's much different than mine, and if they want to embrace their natural hair, that's fine. But it's not always manageable.
It's a right.
Right? And so sometimes it's just the small things. Yeah, but sometimes people don't see it as a right. They say, oh, well, they could go in there and just wash their hair and do whatever. They don't understand, but their hair is not the same as maybe a lot of the other kids' hair that's not Black that you see in care in terms of the difficulty in managing it. Some small things like that. Also, showing kids love, showing them attention. I always say like your preteen and your teen is like your toddler all over again. They might agree. When your toddler's little, the toddler just acts like they need attention. The preteen and teen, they act like they don't need it, but they need it just as much. And they do appreciate it when they get it and it's positive. You know what I mean? So like make sure that you are the one giving them those basic needs that they need, and that you're giving them that love, attention, and affirmation. And that when they want extra things that are not beyond reason, that you make an effort to, just their children. Childhood is sacred and it's short. So as much as you can make an effort, especially if you're a foster care parent, they already were abused already. They've already had it hard. And I know you can't do everything. We know that resources are limited for all of us. I'm saying within reason, what you can do.
No, I love the fact that you added that.
Kid, she asked, the other night, my daughter, she said she wanted some gummies. It was like some Lifesaver gummies. And it was like 10:30 at night. But you know what? I wasn't tired. And I said, you know what? I want her to know that sometimes someone just will respond to your need because they just love you extra. So it wasn't something I had to do. But I had the energy, so I just made sure I wasn't wearing myself out. I wasn't going out the house exhausted. I don't want y'all doing that. But I said, you know what, let me do something extra for her, just so she feels special. And when I came back with them, I didn't tell her I was doing it. When she asked me, she didn't think I was going to do it. She was like just being silly. When I came back in the house with them, she was like, Mom. I was like, yeah. Just to make someone feel special, sometimes that affirmation they need when they're feeling like they're not special. Because they be going through a lot of changes during them teenage and preteens years. So sometimes that just helps. Also, When you know they're survivors of childhood sexual abuse, focus on treatment that does things like help them unlink love, sex, and abuse, establish healthy boundaries, release and process guilt and shame, treatment that helps them see themselves as more than a sexual object, and treatment that really helps them increase their self-esteem, because those are some of the things that sexual abuse does to them that then makes them more vulnerable for traveling further down that continuum. So you want to make sure treatment really focuses on those type of things. And you also want to educate them on commercial sexual exploitation. Knowledge is power. And there are curriculums available to do that, across the United States, things that are online and things that people, do groups in person and whatnot. There are curriculums available, and that is really important. So I think, those are some of the ways that you can, really make sure that, you're supporting them and helping them, be more prepared for what might come their way online, or in person. So thinking about that as well. When you think about, educating them on this stuff, making sure that the online education is a big part of it, because the large majority of youth who meet their recruiters or traffickers in today's culture, they meet them online.
Absolutely. Social media is definitely something that we all need to be aware of what's going on. I remember I had a young lady in my home, and she had only been there maybe 1 or 2 days. And when I looked at her phone, I saw that she was selling herself for $10 for 10 minutes because that's what...
Poor baby.
Exactly. 12 years old. And so I think that...
Yeah, and that's the thing I don't understand. Yeah. And how could that ever be her fault? How could that ever be judged in any kind of way?
No question. Absolutely.
Like whatever led her to that point at 12 years old, we know it was horrible. Period.
Absolutely. No question. No question. And she's, I think we need to bring this back, and I love the fact that you brought this up. We all have a need. I mean, we all have needs. We need our needs met. The needs are not just food, water. It's attention. It's somebody needs to hear me. I'm having these big feelings and I don't know what to do with them. And if you're not going to listen to me, I'm going to find somebody on social media or at school or whatever to meet those needs. And that need for attention is huge. Just like you said, a terrible two and terrible teens. I mean, they're so much the same. The 2-year-old
yes, they are.
The 2-year-old throws a tantrum right on the floor, and caregivers pay attention, parents pay attention because they need to. Well, our kiddos that are teens can't really throw themselves on the floor. So what are they doing that says, please meet my need?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that's so important. And when we have kids in our home, what are some of those signs that we would look for that perhaps they have been a victim of CSEC? Is there certain behaviors that that we can, kind of isolate and say, okay, I need to get therapy for my kiddo?
Yeah, well, okay, one thing for sure is if they have previous prostitution or loitering arrests. So say you get someone that's like, 17 or 18, but you see, when they were 12 or 13, they were arrested for this when they were still arresting kids. You know what I mean? Then that's a sign that even if they're not a victim now, they experienced this at some point and they may need some support. So it's nothing they ever return to. You know what I'm saying? Also, if they show signs of being in a domestic violence or like a teen dating violence relationship, you want to look closer and make sure that, they still need help for that too, but you want to make sure it actually is that and it's not sex trafficking and it's looking like domestic violence, but it's actually sex trafficking. So that could be another sign, like signs of DV. Also, if you notice they're starting to have a lot of inappropriate relationships with adults that don't seem official, not official mentors, not official family members that you know of, new auntie showing up, new godmama showing up, a brother showing up, things like that, that definitely is a sign. Oftentimes they might start, having these frequent periods of, leaving home or leaving school. So maybe, they start staying gone for maybe extended periods of time that they weren't staying gone for before, where they're not like gone all together yet, but like these like patterns are starting to kind of develop. They could show up with new tattoos. And these tattoos are usually on very visible parts of their body. So parts of their body that even if you're wearing a t-shirt and a pair of jeans, the tattoo would possibly still be showing. They may show up with new belongings and they have no means in which they should be purchasing them. So it's like it doesn't matter if whatever they have is cheap or expensive. If they didn't have any money, where did it come from? They also may just like They also may show like a notable change in like how they're presenting. So it could either be like they start dressing very sexualized, or it could be more behavioral. Like they were more open with you and now they're very defensive when you're trying to find out about anything. They're like very guarded and very defensive. That can definitely be another sign. They may also glamorize the commercial sex industry with other youth that may be in care. That could definitely be another sign. If you have access to see their social media, they may start posting really sexually explicit comments and photos on their social media. That would be another sign as well. Sometimes they'll start using a lot of slang, like daddy, like trick, like, the blade. They'll start using like a lot of slang from the commercial sex industry just in like their everyday convo. And then sometimes they're getting picked up, not arrested, but they could be getting picked up and returned to a placement or the assessment center from an area that's known for high exploitation activity. That can definitely be another sign. And so those are definitely some of the signs that we've seen in youth, over the years.
Wow, really helpful. One of the things you mentioned was tattoo. What's the significance of the tattoo?
The tattoos are kind of like, I think they serve the same significance like a gang tattoo. So it associates the child with the trafficker. So the tattoo is usually the trafficker's name or brand or, and it's on more than one victim.
Okay, yeah, I agree. Brand. So basically ownership, right? This is mine. Is that kind of what it is?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Wow. How do we keep our kids safe from these predators? I mean, we have such a huge job, right? We love these kids, but oftentimes they come into our home, not at birth, right? They come in maybe at 12, and we're not privy to their background, as I said before. And then maybe we see the tattoo. We start to hear the language that kind of, makes you start to think, what does a person do? I mean, from the caregiver perspective, you said get them help. What does that look like?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I would say use an attachment-focused approach.
Okay.
Do not underestimate the power of the relationship you develop with your young person.
Okay.
That can be, the most transformative, thing in their life is the actual relationship they develop with you. So, don't underestimate the power of the relationship. You know what I mean? So that's like that I say first and foremost, relationships are restorative. And many of these youth, they experienced hurt and betrayal in the commercial sex industry and before the commercial sex industry through a relationship. And a lot of their healing and restoration also needs to come through a relationship. And oftentimes they're getting services and care, but not the relationships that they need, that we all need.
Well, Ms. Nola, thank you so much for giving your time and your passion and your love for these kids, for helping us to understand what CSEC looks like, what we can do to help prevent a child from being exploited, and just for sharing kind and common hearts. I so appreciate your time. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
As we wrap up our conversation with Nola and her valuable insights on caregiving, I'm excited to introduce our next guest. Please welcome Brandy, who will be sharing her experiences as a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation as a foster youth. Brandy has generously volunteered to share her story with us, and I'm so grateful for her bravery in doing so. She'll be offering advice to caregivers based on her journey towards healing. So let's dive into our conversation with Brandy. Hi, Brandy.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here and sharing your story. This is such a challenging topic. It can bring back some pretty horrific memories that you might have, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on and just your willingness to be vulnerable in front of myself and our listeners. As caregivers, we oftentimes wonder what the life is of the kids that we care for. And CSEC children and youth are that almost like, let's not talk about it. It's a scary thing. So, Brandy, if you could share a little bit about kind of who you are, and as much as you can about your story, I'd sure appreciate it.
Yeah, my name's Brandy. I currently work for the Reproductive Health and Equity Project, more commonly known as REP. I'm on the youth advisory board, and then I was in and out of the system from 8 until 14 or 13, and then I permanently entered at 14. And I spent time in the system in California, Michigan, and New York. So I've had a lot of varied experiences with what we're going to talk about today. But I also agree it's like really important that it has to come up in conversation with youth. And I kind of wish that people talked with me about it when I was younger.
What could they have said? What was it that you needed them to say?
I just feel like sexual topics in general were such a taboo topic when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
But then like going in the system, so many things were normalized. Like one example, a lot of female identifying youth would just like go into sexual exploitation because they're like, oh, I'm going to make money from it. And that's a good thing. But we like looking back, it's like, oh, we were minors. That's not appropriate at all. But back then we're like, oh, this is so cool. It's like an easy way to like make money. I don't see anything that's wrong. I'm so mature. Just cause like no one ever brought it up to us or talked to us about it. So we didn't know any better.
So it almost seemed like you were in charge, like you were like choosing to do something so that you had money to buy what you wanted to buy.
Yeah, it really did. And like, there's this thing even now where it's like, oh, I'm a boss chick and like I'm responsible for myself. That's how we all felt when we were like young teens. We're like, oh, we're making money. We're so cool. And it's like, oh, now that I'm 25, I'm like, that is not cool. That is so messed up. Like, but we were young, so we just didn't know.
How did that happen? I mean, how did a young child, I assume you're talking about the 8 to 13 age range, since that was kind of the foster experience time. How does a child that young find a way to make money in that world? I mean, how do you even get started? I mean, not that I want people to do that, obviously, but how can we prevent it? We have to know how they're getting into it to know how to prevent it.
Yeah, I feel like one of the ways that I've noticed, either like me, people close to me, or even people I met in like group homes and shelters and things like that, I feel like the way we kind of like get it in our minds in the first place is just like a lot of us have been like exploited or abused by people we know already, like family members or step parents. So that's when we start kind of viewing it as normal and like, oh, this is kind of the role we play in the world. And like I already said, we're so young, we just don't know that that's not right. And then when we enter the system, like unfortunately, in all 3 states that I've been in, I noticed that especially in like group homes and shelter settings where there's so many youth and like not enough staff to supervise all of them,
Mm-hmm.
I just feel like the opportunities kind of just show up. It's not necessarily like, oh, we're looking for them. Like they just come to the group homes and the shelters, which is like weird to say, but I'm like, no one's really like monitoring like who's showing up there, or they're not doing it enough. I know some shelters try. And then it's like when you're that young and like helpless, it's like, well, this has already happened to me for free and all I got out of it was trauma. So why wouldn't I do it for money?
Wow. I mean, as sick as that sounds, right? And my heart is just like, wow. I could see how a young kid would say, well, I did it already and I got nothing out of it. I might as well, do it. So what can we do? What defenses can we put up? What can we say to kids to say, I recognize that this has already been done, but this is the harm it can bring. What would resonate with kids that are young?
I feel like there's a lot of things. First of all, I feel like just making it not so taboo to talk about like sexual health in general and like talk to youth about like, oh, this is wrong. Because like in normal households, like I noticed a lot of my friends' parents had the talk with them where it's like, oh, don't let people touch this area. Like talking with them as soon as possible, like when they start school. Whereas like people like me, it's like, oh, I didn't know anything until it was basically too late. Like I was well into high school. So you just have to have those conversations early and like talk to them about how it's not right. And like in an ideal world, you would talk to them before something happens, but that's not how life works, unfortunately. And then like another thing is just, I noticed that people will associate like sexual trauma and sexual abuse and the choices people make with like their sexuality. Whether it's like, oh, I'm bi or pans, asexual, or their gender identity. And that kind of pushes youth away more, because it's like whether or not that's necessarily true, you shouldn't correlate those two together. Like, oh, this person's being sexually abused or exploited, that's why they're bisexual. Like that was just something that really frustrated me when I was in the system, especially because I identify as LGBT myself. Mm-hmm. And it's like these two things aren't correlated. Like even as an adult, I still don't see them as correlated, and it just made me not want to listen to social workers or people that were trying to help me, because it just kind of felt like they were misunderstanding me on purpose.
Almost like they're clueless, right? Like you just don't get it, right? I mean, I think if I'm hearing you right, I think what you're saying, and I agree with you, is that we can't come in with kind of pre-existing ideas and thoughts that, oh, the reason why you're vulnerable to be exploited is because you identify as, or you become that because you were exploited. You know, like they're somehow connected, and they're simply not.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you say talk to a youth, and forgive me for getting down into the weeds, but I think that, you know, caregivers, parents, we really need to understand what should we say. So not just, okay, we need to have this talk. What is that talk? What is it that I can say to my child to keep them safe from being exploited?
Yeah, it's a little complicated. It varies on like the person, because some people go into like sexual exploitation, but they've never been abused. And with those people, I feel like it's easier to talk to them, because then you can have like a conversation from scratch where it's like, oh, just telling them like if someone who's this much older than you, like that's not appropriate. Or saying like, what do they have in common with you, to be honest? And like, what are their intentions? What are you gaining out of this? But then when someone has been abused, I feel like you kind of have to be more like trauma informed when you're talking to them and kind of help them to heal before you can have that conversation. Cause it's really hard to listen to someone, even if they're trying to help you, when you're still hurting and like still trying to heal from something that happened. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know.
No, I like what you said, because you're basically saying approach them where they're at. Don't have your agenda first, have their agenda in front of you. So if you have someone who is traumatized and really hasn't been going down that path of healing yet, you don't want to take them past that, right? To a point. I know last night I was talking to my 15-year-old, and I realized it was like all of a sudden, like a bolt of lightning hit my head. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm talking to her right now from my agenda. And she absolutely was resisting, didn't want to hear what I had to say. And no matter how hard I tried to tell her my agenda, it wouldn't get through. I mean, she was absolutely like I was talking to a wall. And all of a sudden, I just felt like that's not what she needs from you right now. Right now, she needs heart. She doesn't need reason. She doesn't need facts. She doesn't need every reason from 1 to 10 of why she should do what I want her to do. All she needed me to do right then was just listen to her. And she's been here 5 years, and I had to have a lightning bolt hit me, literally, before I could figure out how to get past it. And I think if that's what I'm hearing, am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah.
It's really hard though, isn't it? Especially when you have a child in your home that's been exploited. How do you get on their page? How can we understand as caregivers what it's like to use our body for financial or any sort of gain?
Yeah, I feel like it's definitely easier to talk to people about it if it's something you've already been exposed to or know about or you've experienced yourself. But if you don't fit into one of those categories, then you kind of just have to listen to them explain it, because it's really hard to understand like the reasons why we're doing it or like why we think the way we think unless you listen. And like every single person is different. Like my experience is not the same as even the people like in my group homes or in my foster homes. Like we all have different reasons and experiences. So just like being fully present and listening and understanding where they're coming from, I feel like is a good place to start. And you just have to be prepared to hear the worst because like honestly, it just gets bad sometimes. But don't like start judging whoever's talking to you about it. Just be there for them and like be supportive and like ask them like, oh, how can I help you like get through this, or how can I help you get these resources in a different way?
How long did your journey last through exploitation?
I want to say until I was 17. And the only reason it stopped is because I moved to a different state. And then at that point I was in college, so I had scholarships and stuff. So I felt like I didn't need to do that anymore. Yeah.
Did you do it yourself, or did you have someone that was arranging these meetings?
Oh, it was by myself. And then like the way it happened for me, I feel like is a little not less conventional, but I guess like less stereotypical, where like when I was 15, I was working a bunch of jobs already. And then I would just meet people at work. And of course at the time I didn't think it was inappropriate, but they would be like 30 and I'm 15. And I'm just like, well, I do need more money to like buy my sister food or to pay my cell phone bill or whatever. But yeah, and then when I was younger than that, it was literally just like family members, which thankfully I've like healed from that and I don't talk to those people anymore or people associated with them. But I also feel like that's like not stereotypical, but it's very common where it'll be like family members or step family, because they already know you. And I don't know, they have a way of like talking to you since they've known you since you were little, to making it seem like, oh, it's not wrong. Like nothing's wrong. You don't have to tell anyone.
Which is why it's so important that we prepare children beforehand, right? So that they see the predator coming. And, you know, I had an experience with someone very close to me that was a victim of a predator. And nicest person I've ever met. I looked at this person like, I mean, they were called uncle in our house, right? It was a close friend. And they could open the door and never have to knock. You know, this was a friend. And predators don't announce that they're predators. They truly are the lion, right, in the tall grass. And, you know, they've been watching you. They know your habits. They know what to say. I would think that as a young person, was it hard for you to understand that you were the prey and that it wasn't your fault?
Yeah, I feel like for a long time, I was like, oh my God, like, what am I doing? And I didn't even know what it was that I was doing. So it was just very confusing. And like when all of that started, when I was really young, like 8, it was because my stepdad, like my mom would make comments, which everyone talks about now online in my age group, where it's like, oh, don't wear shorts when this family member comes around. It's like, that's weird. Like, why are you saying that? But that's what my mom would do. And then like he would just do things. And then, I was like, well, this is my fault because I decided to wear shorts today, even though it's 100 degrees.
Right. You have every darn right to wear shorts.
I know. And then like looking back, I'm like, why are you sexualizing an 8-year-old? Like, it's hot. I don't know. I just want to wear shorts.
You have every right, girlfriend, to wear shorts.
Yeah.
That is not on you. That is not on you.
It's just so weird. And then like, I feel like part of the reason why I thought it was my fault and normalized it is just because like my mom would blame me and like she's my parent. And so I'm like, just like young me is all confused. I'm like, well, if she's my parent, like she must be saying something true and like right. And then when things would happen like to her from my stepdad or like I have 2 younger brothers, they're half brothers. When things would happen to them, they would just blame me because I was the one that was like, oh, I don't know. Like I would try to speak up about it and then I would get punished for it. So then after that, I'm like, well, I didn't benefit from it that time. So let me benefit from it now because not benefiting kind of sucked.
Well, it's almost too, I would think anyway, that you have a sense of control. Like I didn't have control when this dude did it, but now I have control on who, when, where, and I have something beneficial afterwards. So you're in control.
Yeah. And like, this sounds messed up at school. It kind of gives you like a sense of like popularity because it's like, oh, I'm doing this and I'm getting money, even though we're so young. And everyone would be jealous and think like, wow, she's so cool and so mature. And obviously, no, it's bad.
What part of it makes you popular? Is it the fact that you can buy things that, that people are envious of, or it just gives you a sense of self-esteem? I mean, I'm confused as to how that relates with popularity.
Yeah, I think a lot of it had to do with like, oh, I have money. That other people don't have. And then also like I can buy things and I wasn't buying like appropriate things. Like I would buy alcohol and stuff, which is unfortunate because I was so young. And then I don't know what we were thinking because we were kids, but everyone's like, that's cool. Like you're getting money for doing that. And like, I'm sure other kids could relate to that was just happening to them and all they were getting was trauma. And they're like, I want to get money too. And then I want to be an adult and do adult things. And like, yeah, it's like messed up, but that was like our thought process back then.
You know what? You're a victim. You're a victim, but you're a survivor, right? What was the light that went on? What was said? What was something in your life that all of a sudden you said, oh, heck no, I'm not doing that anymore?
I feel like I didn't really think about it until like my first year at college. Because my former school had us take like a women's rights class. And I wasn't concerned about any of that stuff before. I was concerned about like surviving. But then when we were taking it, they were talking about like sexual freedom and like the free the nipple movement, all this stuff. And then it all kind of started making sense to me. I was like, wait, I don't think any of that stuff I did was like actually that liberating for me. I think I was being abused. And then from that, like over time, I've just been like studying more and more advocacy type things and realizing like how truly messed up it was that me and like other people I knew had to go through that. And then for a while, I thought I was asexual too, just because of the trauma. I was like, I don't want to do this like at all with anybody. So yeah, that's kind of when I started realizing, which is unfortunate because I was already 17, 18 at the time.
I'm so proud of you. You figured this one out on your own and you went on to college, and I know you're in junior college now and almost ready to go on to a 4-year, and you are somebody to be admired. And I thank you for sharing with us your story and being vulnerable and helping folks who have never walked in that walk. It's very hard to understand. And one of the things that you shared is talking to our youth early as a tool to help them to to be aware of what can happen. Another tool, I think joining them where they're at, not looking at their journey of a 17-year-old or a 15-year-old thinking, well, you're 15, you should know better. Knowing that they could be actually a 6-year-old, right? Developmentally. And not trying to talk about these really difficult subjects with a kiddo who's just not ready to hear them. Is there any last tool that you think caregivers need to hear so that we can keep other kids from going down this road?
I feel like another tool would be making sure that youth have these resources so they don't feel like they have to like take it into the power of their own hands, basically. Because I remember like at one point when I stopped and then did it again, it's because our foster home, for me, my sister, they weren't feeding us. And then I tried to apply for food stamps, even though I was too young to be doing that. And then they got, instead of helping us to get food and like listening to our problems, they got mad at me for doing that. So I'm like, oh, I don't really have a choice. Like I'm going to have to do something or me and my sister are going to starve. So just making sure that youth aren't put into that position in the first place. Cause I feel like a lot of people only do it out of necessity, and then buying like alcohol and all this other stuff later, they do it to cope because they have the extra money. But yeah, just making sure they have resources to begin with so they don't feel like they have to do that.
I have so much to think about now. You are amazing. Congratulations on the gains that you've made in your life. And I know you're an animal lover. And I know that someday you are going to make the best, I'm going to say, animal trainer out there. And I encourage you to continue to tell your story so that we can help youth that are in the same position that you were not too long ago. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.